Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time, Hardee traveled to Mississippi, then came back to the Army of Tennessee to fight in the battles around Chattanooga. Now we join him as the Atlanta campaign opens in May 1864. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. In early May, William T. Sherman and his army group, made up of the armies of the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee, began a flanking movement around the Army of Tennessee stationed at Dalton, Georgia. The Confederate Army commander Joseph E. Johnston attempted to divine the Union's intentions as they began to move their force to the south, toward Resaca, Georgia. As Johnston moved more troops from Hood's corps to that town, Hardee patrolled the area around Dalton. Soon word came for Hardee to move his entire command to Resaca. The only thing that saved the Army of Tennessee from being cut off from Atlanta was the cautiousness of the Army of the Tennessee's commander, James B. McPherson. McPherson had an opportunity to capture the town, but believed it was too well defended when it was not. Hardee and John Bell Hood got their corps to Resaca and linked up with the newly arrived troops under Leonidas Polk from the Army of Mississippi, soon to become the 3rd Corps in the Army of Tennessee. The Confederates dug in around the town with Hardee holding the center. He placed his headquarters near the front and rode along his lines examining his troops. One soldier remembered, "The air is full of deadly missiles. Lie down, thug, thug." General Hardee passes along the line. "Steady, boys." The old general had on a white cravat. He had been married to a young wife not more than 3 weeks. "Go back, General, go back, go back, go back," is cried all along the line. He passes through that storm of bullets, indifferent to their proximity. "We were lying down, you know." One of his biographers explained, "For Hardee it was simply in accordance with a tested rule of war that a command officer should be present at the point most severely attacked. His observance of this maxim gave rise to a proverb in the army by which his own and other staff officers were guided when seeking him during an action. You had only to listen to see where the fire is hottest and go to it. You will be sure to find Hardee there." Union bullets killed soldiers and their horses around Hardee's headquarters, including his son Willie's horse. William was in school in Athens, Georgia in early 1864 when Terry's Texas Rangers rode through, and Willie was caught up in the excitement and enlisted. The colonel of the regiment found out about the enlistment and sent the 16-year-old back to school, but the schoolmaster refused to take him back and sent him to his father in Dalton. Now he served as a volunteer aide to his father. Hardee allowed his son to be with him during the current campaign, but insisted that once it was over, he would go back to school. When reports came from south of their position that Union forces had crossed the Oostenaula River, the Army of Tennessee pulled back. Johnston attempted to make stands at both Adairsville and Cassville, but eventually pulled back along the Atlanta and Western Railroad. When Sherman moved to the west to outflank Johnston, the Confederates blocked the movement in a long line running from Dallas to New Hope Church to Pickett's Mill. In late May, Sherman and Johnston battled it out along this line, with engagements at each location. Hardee's corps was split up, with William Bates' division on the left and Cleburne's division on the extreme right. Hardee kept in contact the best he could with his divisions, and Cleburne won some of his best praise for his defense at Pickett's Mill. Hardee focused mainly on the Confederate left, with Bates' division and Benjamin Cheatham's division facing off against the Army of the Tennessee. With neither side gaining any significant ground, they both moved back east to the Atlantic and Western Railroad. Johnston, Hardee, Polk, and Hood pulled back to some high ground north of Marietta, Georgia, along Pine and Lost Mountains. 1864 saw Hardee become more religious. Both of his wives and all of his children were confirmed members of the Episcopal Church, but he hadn't joined. Most likely prompted by his newest wife, he decided to be part of the church. Doing so, he looked to his old fellow corps commander Leonidas Polk as an almost spiritual leader. On Tuesday, June 14th, Johnston requested for 2 of his corps commanders, Polk and Hardee, to travel with him to Pine Mountain to view the Union Army and to lay out a strategy to combat the ever-encroaching enemy troops under Sherman. The 3 men dismounted, leaving their staff behind, and climbed the rise, housing General William Bates' infantry division and the New Orleans-Washington artillery. The cannoneers warned the commanders that the Union cannons had found their range and were lobbing shells into the fortifications. Soon a shell burst near the generals. Johnston and Hardee began to walk away, but Polk lingered. The pause resulted in a 10-pound parrot shell passing through Polk's chest. Hardee and Johnston ran up to their friend and colleague, but there was nothing they could do. His escort and security put him on a litter and took him to the rear. One of Hardee's biographers stated, "Hardee lost a friend whom he had come to admire more each year, and a spiritual leader. The night after Polk's death, Hardee had a poignant experience. He received a religious pamphlet that Polk had intended to give him, soaked with the blood of his esteemed friend." Soon the Army of Tennessee moved to another defensive position anchored on Kennesaw Mountain. Sherman did not try to outflank that position. Instead, he attacked it with multiple assaults, many of them directed at the position in the center held by Hardee's troops. A location that became known as the Dead Angle was held by Cheatham's division of Hardee's corps. Despite the numerous attacks, the Confederate line held firm, with Hardee's men doing a great job of throwing the enemy back. Hardee could be proud of what his men accomplished. After the attacks, Johnston pulled back again, this time to the Chattahoochee River, not far from Atlanta. A defensive position was thrown up by the Army of Tennessee, but Sherman began to outflank the position, which forced Johnston to move across the river. The close proximity to Atlanta scared President Davis, who now had to make a tough decision to replace an army commander in the middle of a campaign. Davis didn't want to risk losing Atlanta because of Johnston's constant retreats, so he looked for someone else who could take the command. The only two generals who were familiar with the situation and of requisite rank were John Bell Hood and Hardee. The Confederate Secretary of War admitted that Hardee had ruined his chances of being given command of the army when he refused to take command in December 1863. This left only one other option, Hood, a favorite of Davis. As one of Hardee's biographers explained, Hardee probably would have fought for Atlanta whether Johnston would have or not, but Hardee did not think in terms of military miracles, and almost surely could not have produced one. Hood believed that military miracles were brought about by assuming and sustaining the offense. Whether Hardee's views were practical and Hood's impractical is not the essential question. Only Hood saw real hope for turning the tide of the war. The Confederacy wanted a gambler and a visionary. They could not win without one. With Hood moved up to Army Command, Benjamin Cheatham from Hardee's Corps was made temporary commander of Hood's old corps until Stephen D. Lee could make it to Atlanta and take permanent command. The 3rd Corps commander was Alexander P. Stewart, who took over permanent command of Polk's corps. As the Union forces moved toward Atlanta, they became spread out, offering a great opportunity for Hood to land a decisive blow against part of Sherman's army group. He decided to attack the Army of the Cumberland at Peachtree Creek with Hardee and Stewart's corps on July 20th. It was supposed to begin at 1 p.m., but circumstances prevented Hardee from launching his attack at that time. Hood wanted him to slide his corps to the right to link up with Cheatham's corps, guarding the eastern approaches to Atlanta. It was believed that Hardee would just need to cover about the distance of a division in length. It turned out to be much longer, which delayed the attack more than 2 hours. When the attack began, Hardee's rightmost division under William Bate got turned around in a swampy area and never found the enemy's flank. William H. T. Walker's division encountered heavy Union resistance and were unable to drive them away, and George Maney's division on the far left made a half-hearted assault. This failure to dislodge the Federals resulted in Stewart's corps not having the appropriate momentum to carry his side of the field either, even though he made better headway than Hardee. After the attacks, Hood charged Hardee in his official report and in his memoirs with failing to carry out orders on time. In this charge, Hardee is innocent. He was ordered to both close up on Cheatham and to attack at 1 p.m. He could not do both. So Hardee decided to close up on Cheatham so that there wouldn't be a gap in the Confederate line before he attacked, the more cautious and more practical decision. Hood also claimed Hardee didn't press the attack. This is only partially true, with part of Hardee's command not being able to find the flank, and another not launching as determined of an attack as expected. Hardee probably could have done more to coordinate his divisions and make sure that they completed their task, but he did commit 3 of his divisions to battle, holding only one in reserve, Cleburne's. As the Union armies began to constrict Hood's army around the city of Atlanta, Hood struck out again on July 22nd. Hardee's corps was to take the lead and hit the Army of the Tennessee in the flank and rear, and once fully engaged, Cheatham's corps would launch their own attack against the Union front. Hood claimed that he ordered Hardee to move to Decatur, way behind the Union line, but after a night consultation, it was agreed that Hardee couldn't travel that distance in the required time, and it was determined to simply attack the flank and rear. Nevertheless, Hood claimed years later that Hardee again disobeyed orders, when all evidence supports Hardee in this debate. Hardee marched his men to the location and attempted to align them. The terrain over which the men would have to advance was thick with trees and briar patches. One of Hardee's division commanders, William H. Walker, made a weird decision. He noticed an entangled briar patch in front of one of his regiments, and instead of simply making accommodations for the regiment to move around it, he went to his corps commander to ask permission to do it. Hardee lashed out, saying, "No, sir, this movement has been delayed too long already. Go and obey my orders." Walker rode off and commented to a member of his staff, "I shall make him remember this insult. If I survive this battle, he shall answer me for it." Hardee did send Walker an apology, but Walker was fully insulted and wouldn't accept it. Hardee wouldn't be able to apologize in person, as Walker would be killed soon into the attack. Hardee's men were disjointed because of the terrain, but they were able to drive deep into the enemy's side, split in two Union corps, but the lack of cohesion resulted in the attacks losing momentum. Only Cleburne and Maney's divisions caused significant damage to the Union line. Including killing the Army of the Tennessee commander James B. McPherson. Hood still criticized him for not moving further to the right, even though Hood agreed to the new strategy. Hardee's enemies praised the Confederate general's attack, with Oliver Otis Howard saying it was a Jacksonian march, and Jacob D. Cox writing that Hardee's attack, viewed as a piece of military maneuvering, will excite more admiration among students of the art the more it is examined. Despite the bloody assault, the attack didn't send the Union Army reeling back like Hood had hoped. A few days later, Hood lashed out from the Atlanta defenses again, this time in the Battle of Ezra Church. Hardee didn't participate in the battle, but Hood did send him to the front to take command of all the forces there, but by the time Hardee arrived, the battle was over. Throughout August, Hardee got repeated visits by his wife, traveling from her accommodations in Macon, Georgia, to see her husband. Sherman and the Union juggernaut began to essentially disappear from around the works surrounding Atlanta, and Hood and Hardee and the other Confederates wondered where the Federals were heading. They hoped it would be north, but indications soon came that Sherman was striking for Jonesboro or Rough and Ready south of Atlanta. Hood dispatched Hardee and Lee south to block the approaching Union Army. At Jonesboro, part of the Army of the Tennessee were across the Flint River and began to fortify their location. Hardee was to command both corps, so he placed Patrick Cleburne in command of his corps so he could see to the actions of both units. On August 31st, Hardee placed Lee's corps on the right and Cleburne's corps on the left and planned to attack, moving northward, to drive the Federals away from the railroad. However, mishaps led to the Confederate defeat. Lee attacked too early, and Cleburne's old division, now under Mark P. Lowry for this battle, moved west instead of swinging north, creating a gap in the line which forced Cleburne to fill the gap with Maney's reserve division. None of the rebel attacks materialized into anything significant, and soon Hood recalled Lee's corps back to Atlanta, leaving Hardee at Jonesboro. The Union attacked the next day, and Hardee withdrew further south to Lovejoy Station. With his command separated and the approaches to Atlanta captured, Hood withdrew from the city. Sherman captured Atlanta, and a war of words erupted between Hood and Hardee. Hood, in his official report, correspondence with politicians, and later his memoirs, attacked Hardee and blamed him for the fall of Atlanta, claiming that if Hardee had done his duty at Jonesboro, Atlanta would have been saved. Hardee wrote his official report and asked the Secretary of War to publish it in its entirety for the truth of history. However, Hood's attacks already began to damage Hardee's reputation. There was one charge that Hardee partially agreed with, that he did not attack the enemy vigorously. As Hardee explained, it is not surprising that troops who had for 2 months been hurled against breastworks only to be repulsed or to gain dear-bought and fruitless victories should now have moved against the enemy's works with reluctance and distrust. He put his troops into battle under the most unfavorable conditions after a 15-hour march, completely worn out, and knowingly attacked a superior force under most disadvantageous circumstances. One of Hardee's biographers wrote, "Hardee mistimed the assaults and didn't keep abreast of the situation, especially on his right with Lee's corps. In this way, Hardee failed as an army commander. Hardee should be held responsible for the generally poor performance of the two corps entrusted to his direction. On the other hand, the battles of September 1st, 1864 at Jonesboro and September 2nd at Lovejoy Station did credit to Hardee and his command. Although they were outnumbered and their defensive works were poor, they succeeded in holding their position and inflicting serious loss upon the enemy. Hardee handled his divisions well and seemed to have gotten the maximum performance out of his men. His retreat from Jonesboro to Lovejoy Station was conducted with skill. A malfunction here could have cost him his corps. Following the loss of Atlanta, both Hood and Hardee appealed to Davis for help. Hardee wrote, "Unless this army is speedily and heavily reinforced, Georgia and Alabama will be overrun. I see no other means to avert this calamity. Never in my opinion was our liberty in such danger. What can you do for us?" The reply came, "No other resources remain." Hardee asked to be transferred. He hoped that he would be sent to Mississippi and Richard Taylor would be sent to take his place, but that wouldn't happen. He also thought seriously about resigning from the army. He wrote to his wife, "For on your decision I shall act. It is a grave step to take in time of war and in the face of the enemy, but if you think it is right, I am prepared to do it. A woman's instincts are sometimes of more value than a man's reason and judgment." Davis visited the army after the loss of Atlanta, getting to the army at the end of September. He reviewed the troops and had a discussion with the senior commanders of the Army of Tennessee. After an informal review of Hardee's troops, Hardee rode back with Davis and told him what he had long awaited to tell him in person. Hardee outlined that even though Hood was chosen because he was a fighting man to stop the retreat conducted by Johnston, Hood on numerous occasions urged Johnston to retreat instead of fight, and when Hood had the opportunity to display his aggressive nature, he had decided against it. Hardee told Davis that he had never failed to cooperate and do whatever Hood asked. He owned up to possible mistakes, but defended himself to the President. On September 28th, Davis sent word to Hood that Hardee would be transferred. He would head to the coast to oversee the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Before he left, the Army gave him a heartfelt send-off. Hardee was flattered with the most touching ovation that has been given any officer. The whole corps quitted quarters and besieged his encampment in a forest of pines. Scarcely enough men were left for guards. Officers and men were moved to tears at parting with their noble old hero. Amid cheers for Old Reliable, the crowd rushed towards their loved commander, and thousands of the old heroes from Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Texas had the melancholy pleasure of taking by the hand and saying farewell to the war-worn veteran who led them on so many bloody fields. They had lost the pride of our corps. Hardee headed to Charleston, South Carolina, and found a Herculean task. He began to negotiate for prisoner exchanges, something he wasn't authorized to do, but he explained that he barely had enough food to feed his own limited amount of troops, let alone prisoners, and if he was going to feed anyone, he would prefer it to be Confederate troops. He also sent out work crews to raid unused or endangered railroads for their rails to be used on more important railroads, as those needed repaired. More defenses for Charleston and Savannah were also on his mind as he worked tirelessly to use the limited resources to the best of his ability. He possessed a little over 12,000 men to patrol his entire department, which mainly focused on Georgia and South Carolina. However, in November, Sherman came out of Atlanta and began his march to the sea, with his eyes set on Savannah. Hardee would move to Savannah to build up its defenses in anticipation of Sherman's push to the coast.